Have you ever promised yourself you would change, only to find yourself repeating the same old patterns as if some invisible hand was pulling the strings? You tell yourself this time will be different. This time you will stay consistent. But then, a week passes, maybe two, and you are right back where you started, wondering if your willpower is simply broken. But here is the truth most people never realize. It is not about a lack of discipline. It is not because you are lazy or unmotivated. The real reason you keep falling back is because there are parts of you that have never been fully seen. Parts that have been exiled, ignored, or covered up. And from the shadows, these parts silently steer your life, your choices, and your reactions. We have been taught that discipline means forcing ourselves to wake up earlier, work harder, and push through resistance. But if you look deeper, if you follow the thread of real psychology, true discipline is not about what you do on the surface. It is about whether you have the courage to face the totality of who you are. When you stop running from the messy, uncomfortable, and darker pieces of your own nature, something profound happens. You become grounded. You become less reactive. You become incredibly difficult to provoke or manipulate. People often mistake strength for loudness or aggression. But the deepest form of strength is silent. It comes from a place of inner unity, from someone who has walked through their own basement, faced what was hiding there, and returned to a center that cannot be easily moved. In this video, we are going to explore a path to discipline that has nothing to do with hustle culture. We will look at how becoming so internally integrated that your very calmness commands a quiet respect. If you are ready to stop fighting yourself and start understanding yourself, then stay with me, because to become truly solid, you may have to let go of the version of you that has been performing for the world. Chapter 1. The strength of stillness. Stop broadcasting, start becoming. The first layer of this work is not about taking action. It is about withholding it. It is about the discipline of silence. But not the silence of not speaking. It is the silence of not performing. Think about your typical day. How often do you feel the urge to tell someone about your new plan? How often do you catch yourself crafting a post, a story, or a sentence designed to show people that you are about to become better? We live in a world that rewards broadcasting. We share our intentions, we collect likes, and we soak in the encouragement. And here is the neurological trap. When you tell someone your goal, your brain releases a cocktail of chemicals that feels suspiciously like accomplishment. You get the reward before you have done the work. The pressure to perform vanishes. The drive to act dissolves. And months later, you are left wondering why you are a professional starter but a terrible finisher. There is a powerful saying that goes, "He who looks outside dreams. He who looks inside awakens." When you are constantly seeking external validation for your path, you are living inside a collective dream. A dream where being seen as disciplined is more important than being disciplined. A dream where progress is measured by compliments rather than results. But the moment you turn your gaze inward, you wake up. You stop chasing the image of a better you, and you start confronting the reality of the current you. Silence is the pivot point. It is the decision to pull your energy off the social stage and bring it back into your private world. In that private world, there is no audience. There is no applause. There is only you, your real motives, and the brutal level of honesty you are willing to tolerate. I remember watching a colleague start a fitness journey. Let us call him Mike. Mike bought all the gear. He changed his profile picture. He posted daily updates about his early morning runs for the first week. The comments poured in. "You are an inspiration. Keep going." He felt amazing. But by the third week, the posts stopped. The gear gathered dust. When I asked him what happened, he said something that stuck with me. He said, "Every time someone praised me, I felt like I had already crossed the finish line. The recognition replaced the work. Mike did not lack the physical ability to run. He lacked the silence to grow. Silence is like the darkness a seed needs to germinate. If you dig up the seed every 5 minutes to check if it has grown, you kill it. Your goals are the same. They need a stretch of time where no one is watching, no one is commenting, and no one is judging. When you constantly expose your process to the light of social approval, you pull it out of its natural environment. The discipline of silence is trusting that the work has value even when nobody knows you are doing it. From a psychological perspective, this problem lives in what is called the persona. That is the social mask you wear to fit in. The persona is not evil. You need it to function in society. But when you become fused with the mask, you start living for the reactions of others. You act in ways that will be accepted. You share things that will be praised. And when the approval fades, you feel your sense of self fading with it. Silence is the first step of separating yourself from that addiction. When you no longer need to announce every step forward, you are forced to ask a difficult question. Why am I actually doing this? If you stop posting about your workout, do you still work out? If nobody knows you are learning a language, do you still study? If nobody calls you hardworking, do you still put in the hours? Those questions are uncomfortable because they strip away your excuses. Sometimes, you realize you were doing many things just to be seen. That realization might sting. It might bring shame. But shame that is brought into the light of awareness is the beginning of real maturity. There is an interesting side effect to this silence. When you stop explaining yourself, a gap appears in your interactions. Human beings hate gaps. They start to speculate. They wonder what you are doing. Why are you no longer oversharing? Why do you not need their response anymore? Your silence creates a depth that words cannot create. Not because you are trying to be mysterious, but because you are no longer living to impress. Imagine two people entering a room. One talks nonstop about his vision, his struggles, and his upcoming success. The other listens more than he speaks, answers briefly, and asks questions. An hour later, who leaves the stronger impression? Often, it is the second person. Because his silence contains something unrevealed. People feel both curious and cautious around what they cannot fully read. But do not misunderstand. This is not a manipulation tactic to seem cool. It is a tool to see yourself clearly. When you stop talking about your goals, you finally hear the voices inside. You hear the impatience to prove yourself. You hear the fear of being forgotten. You hear the insecurity when no one is paying attention. And when you hear them, you have a choice. You can act on them, or you can watch them pass without reacting. That is the essence of discipline. There is a subtle paradox here. The more you talk about changing, the less you actually change. The more you need others to know you are improving, the more dependent you become on them to keep going. Silence cuts that loop. It is like unplugging from an external power source and learning to generate your own electricity. At first you will feel empty. You will wonder if you are disappearing. But in truth, you are simply stepping off the stage to build the foundation. Mike tried changing one small variable. He stopped announcing his plans. He stopped posting updates. He did the work in the dark. The first month was hard. He felt like he did not exist if nobody knew he was trying. But then, a strange thing happened. He started training more consistently. He completed more projects. And when people finally noticed the change, he did not have to say a word. The difference was visible in the way he walked, in the calmness of his eyes, in the absence of noise. The lesson is brutally clear. Do not waste your fuel announcing you will change. Use that fuel to actually change. Do not explain every step. Let the results speak when they are ripe enough. When you master the stillness of silence, you start building a core that does not depend on other people's eyes. And from that foundation, we move to the next level. where silence is not just about the external world, but about facing the internal basement you have been avoiding for years. Chapter 2. Meeting the monster, integrating the hidden self. Once you have learned to be silent before the world, no longer displaying every intention, another door opens. That door does not lead to a stage. It leads down, into the basement, the place where you store everything you are ashamed of, everything you do not want anyone to know, everything you do not even want to admit to yourself. This is the hardest form of discipline. Facing the shadow. The shadow is not some mystical demon living in your soul. It is surprisingly close. It shows up in your daily life. It shows up the moment you feel a twinge of jealousy when a friend buys a house. It shows up when you overreact to a minor piece of criticism. It shows up in the secret satisfaction you feel when someone who once doubted you fails. That does not make you a bad person. It makes you a human being with a hidden side. We all build a self-image. I am a patient person. I am not greedy. I am rational. This image helps you navigate society. But when you completely identify with the mask, anything that does not fit gets thrown into the basement. You do not want to see your own envy. You do not want to touch your own rage. You do not want to admit your hunger for recognition. And those very things become the shadow. There is a famous line that says, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." You do not mature by pretending you are full of light. You mature when you dare to bring the darkness into awareness. Because whatever you do not make conscious will run your life from behind the curtain. It decides how you react. It decides how you sabotage yourself. It decides who you choose as partners. Think of the classic story of the portrait in the attic. A man remains young and beautiful on the outside, while a hidden painting bears the scars of his every sin and decay. That painting is the shadow. It holds everything he refuses to face. He continues living in society with a perfect face, but in the locked room, the image grows more and more warped. The more he denies it, the more horrifying it becomes. Eventually, he is destroyed by the very thing he fled. That story is not a simple moral lecture. It is a deep metaphor for the psyche. What you will not face does not disappear. It accumulates and distorts. Integrating the shadow does not mean acting on every dark impulse. It is not an excuse for cruelty. It is an act of radical honesty. When you admit you can be jealous, you no longer have to pretend you are above it. When you admit you want recognition, you no longer have to hide your ambition behind a mask of false humility. That honesty makes you lighter. Try to hold a beach ball underwater. The harder you push it down, the more it wants to explode upward. The shadow is exactly the same. When you suppress it, pressure builds. And one day, it bursts out in an argument, a reckless decision, or a moment of self-sabotage that ruins months of work. Integration means you stop trying to keep the ball submerged. You let it rise. You look at it clearly. And you learn to live with its presence, without letting it steer the ship. From a practical view, the shadow also holds energies that were simply misunderstood. Many of us were taught that anger is bad, so we suppress every trace of it. But anger is also a signal that your boundaries are being crossed. If you do not recognize it, you will either explode violently or collapse passively. When you integrate it, you learn to say no without guilt. You use that energy to protect yourself instead of hurting others. Similarly, ambition is often labeled as selfish. Many people push their ambition into the basement because they fear being judged as greedy. But ambition is the engine of growth. When denied, it turns into bitter jealousy and quiet comparison. When made conscious, it becomes a clear, focused direction. You stop competing in secret. You just move toward what you want. What makes the shadow dangerous is not its nature. It is the fact that it is unconscious. When you do not know you crave recognition, you will chase it through needy behaviors. When you do not know you fear failure, you will procrastinate endlessly. When you do not know you are prideful, you will treat every suggestion as a personal attack. The unconscious turns you into a puppet, and anyone who learns your strings can control you. But when you start to recognize these parts, a pause appears. You see yourself feeling jealous, and you do not immediately act on it. You notice the heat of anger, and you choose to respond instead of react. That pause is deep discipline, not forcing yourself to be good, but becoming aware enough to see the machinery in motion. A different kind of confidence appears when you integrate the shadow. It is not the confidence of thinking you are perfect. It is the steadiness of knowing you are not. When someone points out a flaw, you do not collapse. You can simply say, yes, I have that part too. When someone tries to provoke you, you are not easily hooked. You have spent too much time watching your own emotions to be dragged around by theirs. What do you actually need to do? It is not complicated. When a strong emotion hits, do not immediately look outside for someone to blame. Ask yourself, what part of me just got touched? Write down the patterns that repeat in your relationships. Identify the feelings you usually avoid. You do not have to fix them tonight. You just need to see them. Seeing alone is a shift. When you are disciplined enough to go down into the basement without turning away, you begin to become whole. You stop splitting the world into good and bad. You understand you are a complex totality. And from that wholeness, a quiet strength appears. The strength of someone who has seen their own darkness. So they no longer fear the darkness in others. If you are ready to keep going, just acknowledge to yourself, I am ready to face what I have hidden. Because the moment you stop running from yourself, no one can easily control you anymore. Chapter 3. The Solitude of Maturity. Standing alone without breaking. After you begin recognizing the darker parts within, a strange shift happens. You are no longer busy proving anything to the world. You are also no longer constantly at war with yourself. But in the place of that noise comes a new feeling. Solitude, not loneliness. Loneliness is the ache of missing connection. Solitude is the richness of being with yourself. Most people fear being alone, not because they hate the quiet, but because in the quiet, they hear what they have been running from. When there is no music, no social media, no conversation to fill the space, you start facing yourself directly, and that is terrifying for someone who has never done it. That is why so many people unconsciously keep themselves busy. Busy so they do not have to think. Busy so they do not have to feel. Busy so they do not have to ask the hard questions. There is a quote that says, loneliness does not come from having no people around you. It comes from being unable to communicate the things that matter to you. When you have lived by other people's expectations for too long, you can be in a crowded room and still feel lost. But when you return to your own nature, you can be completely alone without feeling empty. Because you are no longer betraying what you know is true. I once read a comment from a viewer who said, I lost almost all my friends after I decided to change my life. At first, I thought I was failing, but slowly, I realized I was just growing up. That experience is not rare. When you start changing from the inside, relationships that were built on your old version start to shake. Not because you become better or worse, but because you no longer fit the role they assign to you. Solitude at this stage is like leaving a loud, smoky bar and stepping into a quiet forest. At first, the silence is deafening. No voices, no validation. But then, you start hearing different sounds. Your own footsteps, thoughts you have never listened to, a quiet intuition that is small but real. Solitude is not punishment. It is space. Space to realize what you actually think, what you actually want, and what you actually believe. In deep psychology, the process of becoming whole cannot happen in the constant noise of the crowd. You need distance from the collective to distinguish the voice of society from your own voice. When you are always in an environment where everyone thinks the same and fears the same, it is impossible to see what you are living for. You confuse consensus with truth. Solitude creates that necessary distance. It is like stepping back a few paces to see the whole painting, instead of pressing your nose against the canvas. Here is the ironic benefit. When you no longer depend on other people's presence to feel okay, you actually become more stable in your relationships. You do not cling. You do not panic when someone pulls away. You do not twist yourself into a pretzel to avoid abandonment. This steadiness does not come from not needing people. It comes from learning to be with yourself without feeling hollow. When you can sit with your own thoughts, you no longer fear silence in a conversation. When you can face your own sadness, you no longer rush to find a distraction. Imagine you are a tree. When you are young, you need a stake to stand upright. But if you depend on that stake forever, you will never grow roots deep enough. Solitude is the period where you remove the stake. At first you wobble, but in that wobble, the roots begin to push deeper into the soil. When the roots are strong, you no longer fear the wind. Many people confuse solitude with isolation. Isolation is withdrawing out of fear. Mature solitude is being alone by choice. You can still connect, love, and collaborate, but you do not lose yourself in the process. You do not need the crowd to confirm your value. As you pass through this stage, you may find yourself speaking less, not because you are cold, but because you no longer feel the need to explain every thought. You can decline invitations that do not fit. You can spend a Friday night alone without feeling like a loser. Those small changes are the signs of a person learning to stand on their own feet. Here is a hard truth. If you cannot be alone, you will always be easy to influence. A person who fears solitude will accept toxic relationships just to avoid emptiness. A person who fears silence will chase every trend just to avoid being left behind. But when you can sit alone with your thoughts without panic, you become free in your choices. Solitude is a rite of maturity because it forces you to face the core question. Who am I when nobody is looking? No titles, no roles, no applause. That question is not easy, but the journey to answer it is what actually matures you. The deeper meaning of this stage is not that you separate from the world. It is that you build a stable center within. When you have a center, you can step into the crowd without being swept away. You can love without losing yourself. You can succeed without selling your soul. Solitude is not a sign you are going the wrong way. Sometimes, it is the clearest sign you are finally stepping onto your own path. Chapter 4. Releasing the addiction to approval, the freedom of being disliked. But maturity does not stop at enduring solitude. It gets tested the moment you step back into the world. Because the world does not just want you to exist. It wants you to fit. It wants you to be pleasant, predictable, and easy to accept. And deep inside, you also want to be liked. You want to be agreed with. You want to be seen with warmth. That need is human, but when it becomes the main driver of your actions, it quietly bends your nature until you break. From childhood, we learn that being liked equals safety. A child pleases parents to get food. A student blends in to avoid bullying. Our brains are wired for acceptance because in our ancient past, being cast out of the tribe meant death. Neuroscience has shown that social rejection activates the same brain regions as physical pain. So when someone does not like you, your body genuinely feels hurt. It is not imagination. It is biology. But growing up means you stop living entirely by that primitive survival instinct. When you keep acting just to be liked, you are choosing safety over truth. You say what is pleasant instead of what is right. You laugh when it is not funny. You nod while inside you disagree. Each time you trade away a small piece of yourself, and over the years you no longer know what your real opinion is. There is an old story about a man who falls in love with his own reflection in a pool of water. But there is a deeper angle to that tale. He did not love his real self. He loved the reflection. The image that was perfect, conflict-free, and never rejected. Many of us are also in love with our image in other people's eyes. We are not truly living. We are trying to keep that reflection from cracking. And when someone does not like us, it is like a stone thrown into the water. The image distorts, and we panic. Letting go of the need to be liked does not mean becoming rude or aggressive. It means you stop letting other people's approval determine your worth. You can be polite without being fake. You can be kind without losing your boundaries. You can say no without feeling like a villain. It sounds simple, but it requires deep maturity. When you are overly attached to your social mask, you lose contact with your core self. The mask is designed to adapt, but if you live entirely through it, you become a slave to the gaze of others. The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. But you cannot become yourself if you are constantly adjusting to be liked. Imagine you are a compass. If your needle keeps spinning toward whatever direction people point, you will never know your true north. You will change with every group and every influential person. But when you let go of the need to be liked, the needle starts to settle. It no longer spins with every compliment or criticism. It points toward what you believe is right, even when that direction is unpopular. Here is the paradox. When you stop trying to be liked, you often become more respectable. Not everyone will like you, but the right people will trust you because they feel your consistency. A person who lives to be liked shifts like sand. A person who lives by their values is like rock. And clarity creates a sense of safety for others, even when they disagree with you. Letting go also means accepting that you will be misunderstood. You will be called cold when you are simply holding boundaries. You will be called selfish when you refuse to set yourself on fire to keep someone else warm. People will say you have changed, and you have. Not because you became distant, but because you stopped shrinking. Research shows that people with clear personal boundaries have significantly lower anxiety in relationships. When you stop trying to please everyone, you reduce the pressure of maintaining an image. You do not have to remember what you told to whom. You just have to be consistent with your values. Of course, this is not impulsive rebellion. It is not picking fights to prove how tough you are. It is calm. It is the ability to say what you believe without shouting. It is the ability to stay silent when you disagree without resentment. It is the ability to endure the discomfort of being disliked. The deeper meaning of this work is not that you become scary to others. It is that you stop fearing their gaze. When you do not fear being disliked, you are free to tell the truth. When you do not fear being excluded, you are free to live by your own standards. And when you no longer need approval to feel worthy, you step into a very different kind of power. The power of consistency. If you have ever made yourself smaller to be accepted, if you have ever said yes when your gut screamed no, if you have ever feared losing someone more than you feared losing yourself, know that you are not alone. That is the wound this work heals. Chapter 5, Individuation. Building a self that cannot be shaken. So if other people's eyes no longer define you, who will you be? When that question echoes in your chest, you have reached the final stretch. No longer living to prove. No longer living to resist. No longer living to please. What remains is not an image. It is a structure, not a reaction. It is a center. This is the discipline of individuation, the process of becoming a unified self, where the different parts of you no longer pull you in opposite directions. There is a line that says, No tree can grow to heaven unless its roots reach down to hell. Individuation is not about looking good on the surface. It is about daring to look down into the depths where your fear, jealousy, and old reflexes live. When you have the courage to touch those parts instead of avoiding them, you start building a foundation that cannot be cracked. Most people think they are free, but watch closely. One compliment can lift them into the clouds. One insult can crush them into the mud. One cold look from a stranger can ruin their entire day. They believe they are making choices, but they are actually just reacting. They are a puppet on strings, and anyone who finds the strings can control them. The discipline of individuation starts with something very small, a pause. Between the event and your reaction, there is a brief gap, a fraction of a second. Most people do not even notice it. They go straight from trigger to explosion. But when you start to notice that gap, you step into the realm of choice. And choice is freedom. Imagine a navigation system. If that system depends entirely on external signals, one glitch, and you are lost. But if the system has a stable internal processor, it can filter out the noise, correct for deviation, and stay on course. Individuation is building that internal processor. When your inner center is strong, you are no longer distorted by praise. You are no longer crushed by criticism. You are no longer swayed by the crowd. Another way to think of it is the axle of a wheel. If the axle is bent, the wheel shakes violently with every rotation. A small bump can throw it off the road. But when the axle is perfectly centered, the movement is smooth and steady. Individuation is straightening that axle. Before this integration, you live like a mirror. You reflect whatever environment you are in. At work, you speak one way. At home, you change. With friends, you shift again. You are not trying to be fake. You are just trying to survive. But constant adaptation leaves you with no direction. When you begin individuating, you do not stop adapting. You just adapt from a fixed center. You can change your expression, but your core values do not move. You can learn from others, but you do not lose your identity. This shift is not loud. It happens quietly in how you respond. When someone criticizes you, you do not instantly defend. You listen. You filter. You decide if there is truth in it. When someone praises you, you do not get inflated. You say thank you, and you keep working. You still feel everything. The sting of criticism, the warmth of praise. But you are no longer dragged around by those feelings. At a deeper level, individuation is the reconciliation of opposites inside you. The strong part and the fragile part. The logical mind and the emotional heart. The ambitious driver and the part that needs rest. When these parts stop fighting each other, you save an enormous amount of energy. You stop being exhausted from maintaining a facade. I remember a story about a businessman who attended a silent retreat. He was used to controlling everything and making rapid decisions. But he realized that he was a slave to his own triggers. In meetings, if someone questioned him, he would snap back instantly. When he was praised, he would make reckless deals. During the retreat, he started noticing the physical sensations that came with his triggers. The heat in his chest, the tightness in his jaw, the urge to prove himself. Instead of acting immediately, he learned to breathe. He learned to wait. One evening, he said something simple. I realized I don't have to react. That was not a grand philosophical statement, but it was the moment he stepped into self-possession. When you realize you can choose not to react, you step out of the unconscious manipulation loop. Individuation does not make you rigid. It makes you consciously flexible. You can change your mind when you are wrong, but not because you fear rejection. You can hold your ground when you are right, but not because of pride. You are no longer torn by internal civil war. And when the war inside stops, your energy is freed. A person who has entered this stage carries a different presence. They do not need to dominate others. They do not need to prove their status, but they radiate stability, like a rock sitting at the bottom of a rushing river. The water flows over it, but the rock does not move. The discipline of individuation is not a one-time event. It is a daily practice. Tomorrow morning, before you check your phone, sit still for 2 minutes. Ask yourself, what value will I act from today? Throughout the day, whenever you feel triggered, pause for one breath. Identify the emotion. Name it. Then ask, do I want to react by habit, or do I want to choose by value? Those small moments, repeated again and again, build a steady axis. In the end, becoming a version that cannot be manipulated does not mean controlling others. It means you are no longer pulled around by invisible forces inside or outside. You stop living by reflex. You live by choice. And when you walk into a room with that kind of unity, you do not need to announce that you are strong. People will feel it, not because you are frightening, but because you have completed the deepest journey possible. You have become yourself. Conclusion: the end of the inner war. As this journey closes, perhaps the most important thing you realize is not how to make others fear you. It is how to stop fearing yourself. When you are disciplined enough to look into the darkness, endure the solitude, release the need for approval, and live from your own center, you become incredibly difficult to manipulate. You do not have to tense up to look strong. Your steadiness comes from within. True discipline, viewed through this lens, is not about forcing yourself into an emotionless machine. It is the process of integration. When the light and the shadow stop fighting, you stop wasting energy on an inner war. And when you are no longer at war with yourself, the outer world struggles to shake you. Others may not understand you, but they will sense one thing clearly: you are no longer easily pulled. The quiet respect that people feel does not come from aggression. It comes from unity, from the presence of someone who has crossed the abyss of their own soul and returned to a steady axis. You do not need to say much. You do not need to prove anything. Your presence alone is enough. If this journey resonated with you, remember that the path of integration is a lifelong practice. Every day you choose awareness over autopilot, you build that inner strength. Because when you truly begin to be disciplined with yourself, you do not just change your habits, you change how you exist in the world.